Hi, this is Kris Peters for the Hampton History Museum, and today we're going to talk about the First Anglo Powhatan War. One of the most important conflicts in American history, it's also one that most folks have never heard of. What makes this conflict so important is also what makes it so obscure. This marked the beginning of England's conquest of Native American lands, a topic that we often shy away from. Now, before we dive into the conflict itself, let's talk about the groups involved. On one side, we have the burgeoning Powhatan Empire, a collection of individual Algonquin tribes brought together for the first time under the leadership of a man named Powhatan. On the other, we have the Virginia Company of London, a private enterprise whose Virginia colony would become one of the early stepping stones to the British Empire. Now, Powhatan was an ambitious leader. Born as Wahun Seneca, he adopted the name of his home tribe of Powhatan when he ascended to become the Mamanotoic of 6 Algonquin tribes, which controlled all of the territory from modern Richmond to West Point. This coalition of 6 tribes was the most powerful group in Tidewater, Virginia, but they faced threats from their neighbors to the north and west. These neighbors spoke different languages, had different customs, and were willing to fight over land and resources. Over the next few decades, Powhatan worked to bring as many of the Algonquin-speaking tribes as possible under his influence. He built this young empire through a combination of trade, diplomacy, and conquest, and controlled it through tribute, family connections, and sometimes violence. By the time the English arrived in 1607, Powhatan's growing empire covered most of the Tidewater, encompassing around 30 tribes and a population of 15 to 20,000 people. Now for the English, which is a bit more complicated. In 1604, King James signed the Treaty of London, which ended decades of costly war with Spain and opened up trade between the two countries. But the treaty also recognized Spain's dominance in the New World and prohibited England from interfering in Spain's colonial expansion. To protect the peace, James was unwilling to openly sponsor any colonial venture that might be viewed by Spain as a violation of that treaty. But the treaty said nothing about private companies. In steps the Virginia Company. Founded in 1606, the company had 3 main objectives. Search for the Northwest Passage to the Pacific Ocean in order to open up a new trade route with China and India, exploit the natural resources of Virginia, especially gold, and anglicize the native people, which basically means that the English wanted the Powhatan Indians to abandon their own culture and political systems to become English. The first group of company colonists arrived in Virginia in April of 1607. They were heavily armed and ready to fight against the Spanish Empire if necessary. Now, with the arrival of the English in Virginia, there's something we need to get out of the way. This was not the first time that the Algonquin tribes of Tidewater, Virginia had interacted with Europeans. We can document French, Spanish, Dutch, and English expeditions to the Chesapeake Bay throughout the 16th century. So unlike the way it's often portrayed in film, when the English showed up here in 1607, the Powhatan Indians weren't surprised. And they were happy to do business, because the English had manufactured goods that the Powhatan Indians wanted. Before their arrival, the Powhatan had to rely on trade with their Sioux and Iroquois-speaking enemies to get the resources that weren't locally available, like stone for making tools and weapons, and copper for making jewelry. So when the English arrived, the Powhatan Indians probably viewed them as potential trade partners and possible allies against the Monacans to the west and the Massawomecs to the north. The English had iron tools and weapons, linen and wool clothing, and glass and copper beads. And the Powhatan Indians had food that the English needed. The Virginia Company didn't send people here to farm. They planned to feed the colony through a combination of preserved food shipped from England and trade with the Powhatan Indians. But the trade between the two groups broke down pretty quickly. The company directors in England undermined negotiations between their officers in Virginia and the Powhatan Indians, making it impossible to standardize trade rates and leading to confrontation. At times, the company even traded swords and other weapons with the Powhatan Indians against the judgment of their own officers. Now, another problem is that there wasn't enough food to go around. One of Powhatan's primary means of controlling this region was the food supply. Each tribe in his empire paid him about 75% of their annual harvest in tribute each year. This meant that individual tribes didn't have a lot of surplus food to trade with the English. And finally, over the first couple years in Virginia, Powhatan and the English spent a lot of time playing cat and mouse games with each other, feeling out their strengths and weaknesses. By the summer of 1609, the relationship had stretched to the breaking point. The company was branching out from Jamestown. They sent 100 colonists to settle next to the Nansemond tribe near modern Suffolk, 120 colonists to settle near the Powhatan tribe in modern Richmond, and Fort Algernon was constructed at Point Comfort near the Kicquetan. Fort Algernon had a garrison of 30 men and was put there to guard against the Spanish coming from the Atlantic Ocean. The English proved to be atrocious neighbors. Fighting broke out at Nansemond and Powhatan, resulting in the death of over 100 colonists. In the fall of 1609, Powhatan went on the offensive. He slaughtered all of the English livestock outside the fort and put Jamestown under siege. Over the coming winter of 1609-1610, a time which would become known by the colonists as the Starving Time, 75% of the population at Jamestown died of starvation and disease. At the same time, the garrison of Fort Algernon was left alone. As far as we can tell today, not a single person died at Fort Algernon during that winter, and they even had enough surplus food to feed their livestock. By spring, Powhatan had won the war. In May of 1610, the decision was made to abandon Jamestown and sail back to England. But what happened next is one of the most incredible accidents of American history. After sailing down the river to discover that Fort Algernon had not been under siege all winter like Jamestown, the group made their final plans to sail for England. But as they were preparing to leave, sails appeared on the horizon. It was a fleet of Virginia Company ships carrying a year's worth of food, fresh soldiers, and the new governor. The governor turned the weary survivors around and brought them back to Jamestown. If Powhatan had launched an attack on Jamestown that spring and wiped out the colonists in the fort, or if the survivors had left just one day earlier and West had arrived to find the colony abandoned, he might have turned around and Jamestown could have become England's second lost colony. But with fresh soldiers and new leadership in Virginia, the war resumed, and now the English went on the offensive. After leaving Fort Algernon alone through the winter of the Starving Time, the neighboring Kicquetan were rewarded with an English ambush. On July 9th of 1610, an English drummer lured some of the people from Kicquetan down to the shore of the river, where English musketeers lay waiting. They sprung their trap and killed about a dozen of the Kicquetan, which prompted the rest of them to flee. The town of Kicquetan, with its cleared fields, now belonged to the English. This was the company's first military success since the war had begun, but it was also the turning point of the war. Over the next few months, the English raided towns along both sides of the James River, taking food and sustaining very few casualties in the process. In the winter of 1610-1611, Powhatan put another company settlement up the river under siege. Powhatan inflicted some casualties, but it was nothing compared to the Starving Time of the previous year. In the spring of 1611, the site was abandoned, but the company went on the offensive again. And this time they did something new. They started wearing armor. And suddenly, the English were invincible. Instead of raiding towns and collecting food, this year the English conquered most of the territory along the banks of the James River. And the Powhatan clubs and arrows, and even their newfound swords and iron axes, had little to no effect. By the fall of 1611, the company controlled most of the Virginia Peninsula and the south side of the James River, at which point the war came to a standstill. The company had room to expand, and Powhatan was powerless to get rid of them. The war had effectively come to an end. But despite an end to the active hostilities, this uneasy and unspoken truce persisted, and the English remained in a constant state of military readiness until 1614. The capture of Pocahontas and her subsequent marriage to John Rolfe marked the official end of the war for the English. The First Anglo Powhatan War resulted in two major changes in Virginia. First, the company gained territory where they could expand and bring in new colonists. And second, Powhatan's political expansion was blocked on three sides. The end of the war marked the beginning of England's conquest of Native American lands and the decline of Powhatan's empire. But the people of the Powhatan Empire persisted. Today, there are 6 tribes of Virginia Indians still living in Virginia, which were part of Powhatan's empire. The largest of these tribes are the Pamunkey, who still live in West Point, Virginia. For the Hampton History Museum, this has been Kris Peters. Thank you for joining me, and I hope you learned something new.